Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my route to feminism, my activism, and why I think the representation of women is really important, although I think a lot of people think that maybe it's something of a lesser concern that we can sort of deal with when we've dealt with the more important, quote-unquote, important things. So I didn't used to be a feminist. I've not actually been a feminist for very long. I discovered feminism when I was at university as a mature student. And basically it was in a library reading a book called Feminism and Linguistic Theory, which I know doesn't sound very exciting and is not like the most likely candidate for a feminist awakening, but it was mine. And even more unlikely, it was in a section talking about grammar. But it just really struck me. There was this one thing that she said, the author Deborah Cameron, who's a fantastic feminist linguist, and she was talking about how language shapes the way we see the world, and how specifically gendered pronouns shape the way we see the world. And so grammar purists would say that you use he to mean he or she, and that it doesn't matter, and everyone knows that it could mean he or she, and that's absolutely fine. Similarly, using man to mean humankind, again, that just means a man or a woman, and everyone knows that. But the reality is that when they did studies, when women hear he and when women hear man, they think of a man, unsurprisingly. This was actually a surprise for me, though, and I just sort of thought, God, that's so true. I mean, it was just so automatic for me to hear he and think of a man that I hadn't even noticed it. But once I noticed it, I started to think, God, yeah, well, actually, when I think of a lawyer, I think of a man. And when I think of a doctor, I think of a man. When I think of a politician, when I think of a journalist, any person occupying any kind of public role, any powerful position in society, I pictured a man. And I can't think why that would be. So it wasn't actually a conscious decision to... Oh, am I meant to stand there? Sorry. Hello. Wait, are you clapping me being rubbish? Or anyway, here I am on the red spot. Where was I? Oh, yes, my activism. So, yeah, it wasn't actually a conscious decision to go on from there to do activism that was involved with the representation of women. But in hindsight, I can see that that's what it was. I mean, in fact, the first bit of feminist activism, I don't know if you can call writing a book activism, but the first bit of feminism that I did that was consciously about increasing the representation of women was the book I've just written. But my two sort of biggest pieces of activism before that were co-founding an organisation called the Women's Room, which is a database which all of you should join because you're all incredible women, and none of you will think that you're incredible women, but you are. And it was set up to increase the number of female experts talking in the media, which is currently 80% male. And the immediate catalyst to setting up the Women's Room was 2 days in a row. The Today programme had an all-male panel talking about women's bodies. The first day was teenage girls and their contraception, and one of the experts was the headmaster of Wellington College. And I guess they called him up and he was like, yeah, I can talk about females and teenage girls and their contraception, that's fine. Just to provide a counterpoint to that, when we held a sort of Twitter conversation about expertise and women in expertise, one woman tweeted a tweet I will never forget, which was, I've got a PhD in clinical psychology, 10 years postdoc experience, and I wouldn't consider myself an expert. And when you compare that with the headmaster of Wellington College thinking he can talk about teenage girls and their contraception, you can kind of see a little bit of a disparity here. So I'm saying that in case you're thinking, no, I probably am not an expert, I shouldn't sign up to the Women's Room. This is a huge problem that producers find, is that women don't consider themselves experts. There are obviously other reasons that are to do with the sexism of the news, why women are not featured as experts, but one of the problems is that we have a sense of self-doubt, which is something that I'm going to go into in a bit later. Anyway, so that was the Women's Room. And then a couple of months later, the Bank of England made an announcement about the fact that they were going to remove the only historical female character from our banknotes. So they were taking Elizabeth Fry off the £5 note and replacing her with Winston Churchill. And so it was going to be an all-male, all-white lineup. And I just sort of saw this decision and I thought, this is ridiculous and it shouldn't happen. And to be honest, I thought it was such a stupid, ridiculous decision. I kind of thought I would just point it out, and the Bank of England would go, fair enough, okay, you got us, let's sort this one out. Amazingly, they didn't. And they very foolishly decided to stonewall and try to fight me, and they lost. Anyway, so the sort of headline of that is that Jane Austen's going to be on the £10 note, but what I found was a much more significant achievement was the fact that they agreed that their selection process was discriminatory, and they have reviewed that and they've changed it. And so I think that's a really important part of feminism, is looking at the way decisions are made and questioning the idea of what we consider to be objective. So they actually spoke of their criteria as objective, but they were things like must have good name recognition. Well, immediately that makes it much more likely to be a white man. Must have good artwork, same thing. That's a sort of issue with, that sadly I don't have time to go into today, but I think it's a really important issue within feminism, is challenging the idea of the male default, which is that the male experience of the world it covers women just as well as men. In reality, it doesn't. So you can have documents like the 1951 Convention on Refugees, which seems objective and isn't deliberately set out to make it harder for women to claim asylum than men, but it does. And I can't go into that now, but do look into it, because I think it's a really important part of feminism. Anyway, so the Bank of England caved, and that was great. Unfortunately, some men on Twitter did not like that very much, and they decided to send me a whole load of rape and death threats. And I'm just going to read some of them out now, and I should warn you, they're very unpleasant. Not that you would expect rape threats not to be pleasant, but they're quite graphic and explicit, so maybe, I don't know, cover your ears or something. So, put both hands on my cock and stroke it till I come on your eyeballs. Do as I fucking say, or I'll slit your throat. Go on your knees and suck my dick. I will teach you to learn your place as a woman in this world. Then you will eat my cum. I will rape you, fucking pathetic slut. First we will mutilate your genitals with scissors, then set your house on fire while you beg to die, tonight, 11 p.m. I will shove a 3-foot pole in your vagina. You deserve nothing but pain. I'm going to pistol whip you over and over until you lose consciousness while your children watch and then burn your flesh. You'll never get me. You'll only feel my cock when it's raping you, slut. I have a sniper rifle aimed directly at your head. Any last words, you fugly piece of shit? Watch out, bitch. You are dead and gone tonight, cunt. Kiss your pussy goodbye as we break it irreparably. Shut your whore mouth, or I'll shut it for you and choke it with my dick. So, as you can probably imagine, that was pretty terrifying. The threats were coming in minute after minute, and I didn't know who these people were, I didn't know where they were, I didn't know what they were capable of, and the threats that were being sent to me weren't just sort of, as people said they were, words on a screen that didn't really mean much. They were threatening things to me that had already been done to me. They were threatening things to me that had been done to women I knew. They were threatening things to me that I had read about happening to women. These weren't empty threats. And it was pretty terrifying. But once I managed to get a little bit of distance from the threats, I could start seeing a pattern emerging, which I found sadly quite revealing. And I think that this comment really sums up what it was all about. Women who talk too much need to get raped. This huge fear of a woman's voice, that's what it was about. You know, things like, shut your whore mouth or I'll choke you with my dick, I'll slit your throat. They were all focusing around my speech, my mouth, my voice. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind when we're thinking about how to tackle this, because a lot of people think that this is some kind of internet problem, and it's some sort of weird internet age thing that will solve by making Twitter better or dealing with getting anonymity off the internet. And actually, I don't think that is going to solve it, because actually this is not a new problem. In fact, it's an incredibly old problem. It's been going on for centuries. And I think it's important to place what happened to me within its historical context. So this here is a scold. For those of you who don't know, scolds were women who spoke too much. And what would happen to these women is that they would have a metal mask put on their face. And this metal mask would have a tongue clamp, and sometimes the tongue clank would have a spike on it, so that if the woman who was a scold moved her tongue, she would get lacerated, and she would be her tongue would get lacerated. She'd be paraded around the town. As you can see, this one has a bell on it, and the whole idea was about publicly shaming these uppity, talkative women. Similarly, when you look at the witches, one of the types of woman who was most likely to get burnt for being a witch was a midwife. And that was, again, focusing on this terrifying idea of a woman having access to knowledge and being held to disseminate that knowledge vocally to other women. And they often cut out these women's tongues before they burnt them because they were worried about what they might say when they were being burnt. Another example, this is an anti-suffragette poster. And I mean, it's not really subtle. It's pretty self-explanatory what the anti-suffragette designer is saying there. Shut up, or we're going to nail your tongue to a table. So where does this come from? Where does this huge fear of women's voices come from? Well, I think that you can't divorce this fear of women's voices from the fact that women's voices aren't really heard very much. If women's voices being heard was just a normal everyday thing, it wouldn't be scary because we'd just be used to it. If you look back to when I realized at university that my world was populated by men, that's not just me making it up. That is actually the way our culture is represented, and that's the way that men will inevitably see it as well. And particularly when you have a type of masculinity that is almost defined by being the sex that occupies the public space, that occupies the public voice. When you have women invading that space, it becomes very scary. It's like a kind of existential crisis, I think, because, well, if being a man means occupying the public space and having a public voice and being the dominant sex, then what does it mean for me as a man when women start doing that? And I really think that's the only way to explain such a huge overreaction as sending, if you think it's reasonable to send a woman who, at the end of the day, just wanted a picture of a woman on a piece of paper, if you think it's reasonable to send her rape and death threats, clearly there's something very, very deep going on inside of you, and I would suggest that this is a huge challenge to a sense of masculinity. So I just want to talk to you about what representation currently looks like. So there are between 3 and 4 men for every woman in Westminster Parliament. This is a slight improvement since the 7th of May, when it was almost 5 men for every woman. But this is a body that's meant to represent the whole of the United Kingdom, and I would put it to you that the whole of the United Kingdom is actually 51% female. Out of 107 High Court judges, only 20 are women. And a recent Council of Europe report came out showing only 25% of judges are women, and we came third last in Europe for that. Key Stage 2 of the National History curriculum has no women in it whatsoever. And Key Stage 3 has 4 women, and they're all grouped together under the changing role of women. So men get to be part of the great sweep of history, and women are just women. Which is fine, women are great, but in the media, only out of 13 editors of a national daily newspaper, only 2 are women. This has been an increase of 50% this year, or is that 100%? I'm really bad at maths. It was 1, now it's 2, so you do the maths. When the Guardian had its first female editor, and she's also the first, or certainly for a long time, the first editor to have been to a comprehensive school. So that's pretty good, but it's not enough. Women don't make the front pages. As you can see, that's not strictly true. When there's a nice, pretty picture of a pretty woman, we actually do quite well in the representation stats on that. We make up 80% of those. So a picture that's not considered relevant to a lead news story, women are 80% of those. But men, on any given day, the lead stories have an 84% chance of being about men. I remind you at this point that women are 51% of the population. And if there's an expert quoted, as I said, there's an 80% chance he'll be a man. Female subjects of global news stories were more likely to appear in photographs accompanying the article than men, and women were also more likely to appear in a full body shot and, according to, in the words of the report, in various states of undress. So what impact does it have on women that this huge focus on the way we look rather than what we're doing and what we're saying? Well, obviously, there's the thing that we all talk about, which is the idea of women's self-confidence and the idea that if you're told the only thing that matters is how you look, then that's going to massively impact on what you feel that you can do and what you feel you can offer to society. But actually, it's more tangible than that. It's not just about self-esteem. So there was a troubling and I think very interesting study that came out of the US last year, which looked at the impact on women's poll ratings of a female politician when the media reported on her appearance. And the comment could be negative, positive, or neutral. It could be as simple as she was wearing a blue dress, and they found that her poll ratings were negatively affected, with voters less likely to think she is experienced, strong, effective, qualified, and confident, just by mentioning what she was wearing. So now some of you might be thinking, well, obviously these stats aren't very good, but that's just reflecting the world. When women start being more involved in public life, the news media will reflect that. But that's not actually true, because the news media is reflecting it as worse than it actually is. So, as I said before, women make up about 29% of Westminster, or if we're going to be kind to them, we made about 22%, last month. And there's been research done on UK media stories about politics, and women only make up 1 out of 10 subjects of those stories. So it's representing it as worse than it actually is. That's 29 or 22% is bad, but it's not as bad as 1 out of 10. On global news stories that affect women disproportionately more than men, so for things like HIV and AIDS, women make up only 42% of news subjects. We should be making up the majority. This goes down to 30% when the story is about female electoral candidates. So I don't really know how they did that. This is stories about women, but women aren't the main subject. In Hollywood films, women make up only 28% of speaking roles. And that's a stat that I just find completely baffling, because, you can arguably say, I would posit that you would be wrong, you can arguably make this idea that, well, women aren't involved in public life and therefore they're not going to be so well represented in the news media. I think it's very important to consider, again, it's this idea of what is an objective choice. What we choose to be on the front page of a newspaper on any given day is not an objective choice. It's a subjective decision on what we consider to be most valuable. And it's very telling that we don't think what's happening to 51% of the population is valuable enough to be on the front page of the newspaper. One example that I found quite telling about this and very upsetting, really. So we will all remember last year the beheadings that took place in the desert. They were on the front page of every newspaper. Everyone was talking about them. They were on the news 24/7. And I'm not belittling those beheadings. They were horrific, they were awful, and they were truly dreadful. But 3 women were beheaded last year in London alone between April and September. That's pretty terrifying. 3 women in our capital city over the space of 6 months. Most people haven't even heard of them. We don't know their names. We don't know what they look like. We don't know anything about them. We don't know why they were beheaded. And I think it's worth considering on why those stories weren't reported, whereas the beheadings in the desert were. Anyway, so women make up only 28% of speaking roles in Hollywood films. And this is a very pure example of how women's voices are just not considered important. Women's stories aren't considered interesting. We also only make up 17% of crowd scenes, which is just bizarre, really. And what I find particularly interesting about this latter stat is that, this was a study reported by Gina Davis, who set up a centre that looks into women and representation in the media. And she reported this study that was a study into men's perceptions of gender equality within mixed groups. So basically the finding was that when there was a mixed gender group, if women made up 17% of that group, the men thought it was 50-50. And when it went up to 33%, the men thought women were in the majority. I'm not saying that 17% of crowd scenes in Hollywood films is why that happens, but it's just an interesting correlation, I think. Why does it matter that 51% of the population is being consistently represented as around about 29%? Initially, I think it's important for women for their self-confidence, and I also think it's important for men so that they don't find it too scary when a woman starts asking for a woman's face on a banknote. But you know, how are we going to achieve this? How are we going to change this so that we can have a world where it's not terrifying for a woman to be appearing in the public sphere? My argument is that we should increase female representation across the board. For the reasons that I've stated, for increasing women's self-esteem and also for helping men not find it so terrifying. And actually there's a huge body of research. This isn't just some sort of fluffy, oh, it would be nice for women, we'd probably feel a bit better about ourselves. There are very, very tangible effects that have been demonstrated of having role models that they have on women. So I just want to give you a few examples. So in the world of maths, now I have just demonstrated that I am rubbish at maths, and if I were in front of a group of people who were less feminist, they would probably think it's because I'm a woman. It's not because I'm a woman, it's because I'm bad at maths. But anyway, there is that stereotype that women are bad at maths, and it's so bad, in fact, that it causes this thing called stereotype threat. And this has been documented to have, it's pretty extreme. So something as simple as ticking a box to declare your gender before you take a maths test has shown to make women do worse in that maths test. So actually, it affects your achievements, just being reminded that you're a woman because you're not meant to be good at maths. And so what's happening is instead of focusing on the maths test, you're focusing on trying to disprove the stereotype. Anyway, there is a thing that we can do to change that, and that actually is role models. So they did this other test where they gave two groups a maths test. One was given the test by a woman presented as incompetent in maths, and the other was given a test by a woman who was presented as competent in maths. And in the second group, the women did much better than the first group, and they also outperformed the men. A University of Massachusetts study found that reading short biographies of famous women leaders before taking a word association test, which is basically where they tell you to pick out words that you associate with leadership, and people usually pick out male terms, male pronouns, when they're trying to associate with leadership. But if they'd read female biographies beforehand, it was much more equitable, the number of female pronouns versus male pronouns they picked out. In speeches, this is another interesting one, they did a test where they had some women giving a speech to a room that had no pictures on the wall, and another load of women gave speeches in a room that had either a picture of Angela Merkel or Hillary Clinton just at the back of the wall, just a portrait. And the women in that group were found to give longer speeches, and they also gave better speeches according to both themselves and to the audience. Final example, in political participation, having a single female candidate for office has been shown to increase female volunteer turnout, increase female voter turnout. There's a US study showing that just having a single female candidate for Senate increased women's ability to name a US senator, taking them from 51% to 79%. And again, as in the maths test, that took them above the figure for men. And again, politics is this area where we sort of think women aren't that interested in it and women don't want to be involved. And when you can see what an impact just having one female candidate has on women and their sense that the political sphere is for them, you start to see, well, maybe women don't think that it's for them because they don't see themselves represented there. So the stats are very clear. The presence of role models significantly impacts on women, and by routinely denying women these role models, we're putting unnecessary obstacles in their way to enable them to achieve success and to enable them to be whatever it is that they want to be and not feel like they're constantly having to prove themselves as women as well as just as being whatever it is that they want to be. So that is my argument for why representation is an incredibly important part of feminism. There are many, many more reasons that I could give, but I don't really have enough time. I've probably gone over time already. But one thing I would just like to close on is that I think it's really important in feminism to recognize that you can't separate any part of the oppression of women out from other parts of it. It's all connected, right? So the reason that women are being raped, the reason women are being killed is totally connected to the way that we see women. Otherwise, it wouldn't, men would be being raped and killed in the same numbers, and they're not. So it's very important to address the way women are perceived in order to change the way that they are treated. So if you take one thing away from the speech, I really hope that it's that you want to celebrate other women in whatever it is that they're doing and push women forward, and to create a world where women are seen as 50% of the population, as in fact we are. So thank you very much.